We're going to read another chapter in our book, Magic Elizabeth by Norma Kassirer. This one, we're going to start on page 25, and this is another Sally. Sally moved uncertainly into the hall and, not knowing what else to do, set down her suitcase. "Sally!" cried her aunt, so sharply that Sally jumped. "Stay right where you are. I should think at your age you would know better. Step back, please, step back." Sally, bewildered and unhappy, did so. "Look," said her aunt, pointing to a spot on the rug just in front of Sally's feet. Sally looked, but it was very difficult to see anything in the dim hallway. "Dirt," said her aunt impatiently, "on my rug. We're going to have to make some rules, and the first one is," she spoke very sharply and distinctly, "wipe your feet on the mat before coming in." "I'm sorry," whispered Sally, but her aunt brushed past her, opened the door of a small, narrow closet near the front door, and brought out a broom. She began to sweep the rug angrily, as if she wanted to sweep Sally out too. Sally half expected her to leap onto the broom with the black cat behind and soar away into the night. "And I wish she would," thought Sally. Her eyes misted with tears as she wiped her feet on the mat near the door. Her aunt was muttering as she swept, as if she were talking to herself. "Have to keep this house clean," she said, brushing furiously at one spot on the rug. "Girl came in and cleaned it, took her wages, and never came back." She bent one hand pressed to her back and peered at the spot. Then she sighed, straightened as if she found it difficult to do so, and went on sweeping harder than ever. "How am I going to manage everything myself? I don't know. Can't get anyone who wants to work nowadays." "Swish, swish," whispered the broom, more slowly now. It seemed to be growing tired. "She doesn't want me here," thought Sally in despair. "Now she has me and the house to take care of, and she doesn't like it." She stood on the mat, feeling awkward and very lonely, while her aunt continued to sweep the rug. She felt a lump beginning in her throat, and her feet were wet and uncomfortable. She sneezed. At last her aunt looked up from her sweeping. "Well," she said, "don't just stand there. Come in, if your feet are clean. Here, hold them up and I'll see." Sally leaned against the door frame and slowly raised one foot and then the other, while Aunt Sarah bent to peer at them. Her aunt snorted, straightened up, and put the broom back in the closet. Sally stood listening to the steady drip of rain from the porch roof, which made her conscious of the deep quiet of the dimly lit house. She shivered. Aunt Sarah turned back to her. "Why you didn't wear rubbers, I don't know," she grumbled. "It wasn't raining when we left," whispered Sally, but her aunt did not seem to hear her. "You have slippers in there," she indicated the suitcase. Sally nodded. "Take them out." Sally opened the suitcase with nervous fingers, found her fuzzy pink slippers, removed her shoes, and put the slippers on. It did feel better. "Leave the shoes on the mat," ordered her aunt. "You'll be getting a cold next, and then what will I do with you?" When Sally had placed the shoes side by side on the mat, her aunt said, "All right, you may come in with me." She followed Aunt Sarah through the musty-smelling hall to a larger closet at the back of the hall. It was filled with what looked to Sally like a number of long, dusty black coats. Her aunt reached into the closet, brought out a hanger, and without a word handed it to Sally. Then, seeing that Sally still wore her coat, she snatched the hanger back and said impatiently, "No more dawdling now, Sally. Take your coat off." Sally removed her coat and her hat and stood awkwardly holding them, wondering whether her aunt would give her the hanger or would place the coat on it herself. Aunt Sarah touched the coat with her long fingers and then hastily drew them back. "Wet," she pronounced, as if Sally was responsible for something very bad. "Well, give it to me," she sighed heavily. "It'll have to go over the sink." Sally handed the coat to her, holding it with two fingers as if trying to touch it as little as possible. Aunt Sarah placed it on the hanger. "You carry the hat," she said, giving that rain-soaked object a disdainful look. Sally followed her, holding the hat as if she were comforting it. She felt very sorry for that small, unwanted blue hat, which had already dripped some some rain on Aunt Sarah's rug. They made their way down a long, shadowy passageway leading from the front hall toward the back of the house. Sally was just beginning to feel a tiny bit better as the slippers warmed her feet when from somewhere ahead of them there came a high-pitched whistle. Sally stumbled in alarm, and her hand reached out toward the wall to support herself. Her fingers leaped back when they encountered something soft. She turned her head with an effort, for her neck ached with tension. She was looking into the gleaming glass eye of a stuffed owl sitting on a little shelf attached to the wall. The whistling rose higher. Sally felt quite faint with terror. "Tea kettle," snapped her aunt, who had not stopped. It took a moment for Sally to collect herself, and then she hurried on after her aunt, not wanting to be left behind in this dark hall with the staring owl. Aunt Sarah pushed open the door at the end of the hall. The whistling grew louder. Sally followed her into the kitchen. Tall cupboards of dark wood with knots that stared down like eyes loomed over them, and there was an enormous stone fireplace, quite empty and so huge that Sally could easily have walked into it. She had never before seen a fireplace of this size, and she wondered how it would look with the fire burning in it. This was a very strange sort of house indeed. Hearing a faint ticking sound, she looked upward and saw upon the mantel of the fireplace, along with a number of blue and white pictures and plates, a little clock shaped like a church. Its pendulum was a small gold bell in the steeple, which moved quickly back and forth. It was a friendly-looking clock with a matter-of-fact sort of voice, and you could almost not look at it without smiling. Aunt Sarah hurried to the stove and moved the kettle, and Sally, looking at the clock, began to feel just the tiniest bit better. There were appetizing odors and comforting, bubbling sounds coming from the stove. It was warmer here in the kitchen. There's the little church house clock, and that's the kitchen. Aunt Sarah hung Sally's coat on a hook above the sink, and Sally stood beside the long wooden table in the center of the room, listening to the steady drip, drip of water from the coat. She timidly placed her hat upon the table, and her aunt's long fingers reached out and snatched it up. The hat appeared upon a hook beside the coat. Sally stood without speaking in the strange kitchen while her aunt quickly removed pans from the stove and filled dishes and glasses. If she had not been so frightened, Sally would have offered to help, as she did at home with her mother. But she had no idea how she ought to behave with this strange lady, and so she said nothing at all. "Waited dinner for you," said her aunt's gruff voice. "Had enough for Mrs. Chipley, too. I thought she'd at least want a cup of tea before she left." She indicated the tea kettle, now quietly bubbling to itself. "But everyone's in a hurry these days. Sit down." Sally looked up in surprise to see that Aunt Sarah had already seated at the other end of the table, where Sally could not see her face clearly. The kitchen was lit only by the low blue flame of the gas stove and a rather dusty bulb in the paper shade hanging over the middle of the table. Near Sally was placed a dish of peas and potatoes and chicken. Since she and Mrs. Chipley had eaten dinner before leaving home, she was not at all hungry, but she did not dare to mention it. She sat down, pushing back a chair which stood near the table. The chair legs squeaked over the linoleum, and Sally looked anxiously across at the shadowed figure, fearing that Aunt Sarah might say she was scratching the floor, but Aunt Sarah said nothing. In fact, she did not talk at all during the meal. Shadow wove his way under the table, brushing against Sally's legs from time to time and then darting across the kitchen floor. Sally could hear something bumping lightly across the floor as if he were pushing it with his paw, but she could not see what it was. When Sally at last put her knife and fork across her plate and looked up, her aunt's harsh voice spoke from the other end of the table. "Didn't eat much, Sally. Doesn't your mother make you eat?" "Yes," said Sally in a small voice, "but I'm not very hungry," she added bravely, her voice rising to an unfamiliar squeak on the last word. Aunt Sarah stood up. It seemed to take some effort to unfold herself from the chair. She leaned across the table, one hand pressed against her back and the other flattened on the table. How crooked her fingers were, Sally thought, staring at them. She looked up at her aunt's face, which had appeared in the cone of light cast by the hanging bulb. It looked annoyed or angry, perhaps both. "I think then," her aunt said, "that you better go up to bed. Little girls who can't eat belong in bed." Sally swallowed and looked miserably down at her hands in her lap. "Well," said her aunt, walking around the table to her. She put a bony hand on Sally's shoulder. "Let's go," she said gruffly. Sally stood up and followed her through the pantry and into the hall once more, where she picked up her suitcase. Aunt Sarah had switched on some more lights, and Sally could now see that the entrance to what must be the living room was hung with the oddest curtains she'd ever seen. They were not really curtains at all, but rather a series of tiny colored beads on long strings, hanging close together to form a sort of screen or curtain. The beads moved and made a gentle clicking sound as Sally and her aunt passed. Sally could just glimpse dimly beyond the bead curtains the carving backs of chairs and sofas, which looked very old. Their gentle shapes seemed comforting. Aunt Sarah was all straight, sharp lines and not comforting in the least, and she heard, too, as they passed from somewhere deep inside the room, a very delicate musical sound, faint and rather trembling. The melodeon always does that when the floor shakes. Used to play it when I was your age. Sally was too astonished at such a wealth of information from Aunt Sarah to ask what a melodeon was, but it sounded as if it must be something very graceful and beautiful. She was surprised to see now that the lights were on that a white marble angel stood on the post at the foot of the curving staircase. The angel held a twisted orange bulb like a candle flame in one hand. She was smiling gently and looking out somewhere beyond the front door. Perhaps, thought Sally, to where her parents were. She touched the angel's cold bare foot as she passed. Shadow followed along behind them, almost as silent as a real shadow. The stairway was longer than any Sally had ever climbed before. It went on and on, twisting and turning, and each time that Sally thought they must be at the top, there was another turn, and more stairs leading up and up. What a strange house, she thought again. Sally had become aware of a very loud ticking sound that increased in volume as they went up the stairs. At last, finding herself in a long hallway lined with many doors on either side, she saw, down at the far end near a back stairway, a solemn-looking grandfather clock as tall as the ceiling. There was nothing friendly about this clock, as there had been about the little kitchen clock, and Sally stared at it in respectful awe. She had never seen one like it before, and she was astounded by its size, its deep voice, and by the flashing of its pendulum behind the glass cover. The clock seemed to be announcing that in this part of the house, at least, it was in charge. The floor of the hall was covered by a gray carpet patterned with enormous red flowers. Shadow sat on one of the flowers and gave a huge yawn, which ended in a high, petulant meow. The sound echoed down the hallway, and Sally shivered and began to yawn, too. She was very tired, almost too tired to care about anything. Even when her aunt opened one of the doors that lined the hall and showed her into the room that would be hers, it was a very pretty room, the prettiest Sally had ever seen. Its furniture painted pale blue, its brass bed covered with a ruffled yellow spread, the yellow curtains at an open window snapped in the wind. Sally placed her suitcase on the floor next to the bed. She felt too shy to say, "This is a very pretty room," which was what she was thinking. "Now, how did that get open?" said her aunt. One of the two windows in the room was slightly open. Aunt Sarah walked over to it and shut it. She looked angrily at the wet curtains. While her aunt was frowning at the curtains, Sally looked up at an oil painting that hung over a little green marble fireplace. It was a picture of a little girl about Sally's own age, with long red hair, a sprinkle of freckles over the nose, and round greenish eyes. She wore a yellow bonnet tied with ribbons beneath her chin, a long pale blue dress with 3 layers of ruffles, and high-buttoned shoes. The girl was holding a rag doll on her lap, and she was looking down at it as if she loved it very much. The doll's hair was long and was made of what seemed to be thick strands of golden thread. It had a painted pink mouth curled into a smile at the corners. The eyes were a deep blue, the pleasant shape of watermelon seeds, and painted on with a very thin brush so that each golden eyelash showed. The doll was wearing a long blue dress and small, high-buttoned shoes, and even a yellow bonnet, exactly like those worn by its mistress. Its hands were tucked into a tiny white fur muff. It was the most adorable doll Sally had ever seen, and in less than a moment she had fallen in love with it. "I see," said Aunt Sarah, pointing with a sharp finger that seemed to slice the soft air in the pretty room, "that you're looking at the picture." Sally nodded. "That was a girl who lived in this house a long time ago. She must have been about your age when the picture was painted. This was her room." She lowered her arm abruptly as if she were a mechanical toy that had run down, looked proudly about the room, and straightened the round rag rug which Sally had mussed up, walking over it. "Some of those old things in the picture are stored in the attic," she murmured. But Sally was staring at the picture. The girl in the picture was smiling, so that a dimple deepened in her left cheek. Sally had not noticed that before. It was almost as if the girl's expression had changed just a little since she had first looked at the picture. Sally's fingers touched the dimple in her own cheek. "Why, she looks just like me," she thought in astonishment. "You resemble the girl in the picture quite remarkably," Aunt Sarah was saying. "They called her Sally, too." Aunt Sarah showed Sally where the bathroom was, right next door to her room. She gave her a pink towel and washcloth, and then came back to the bedroom with her. While Sally began unpacking her suitcase, her aunt straightened the curtains, turned back the yellow spread to reveal a bright patchwork quilt beneath it, and moved a vase carefully into the very center of the little table that stood beside the bed. She cleared her throat several times as if she were going to say something, and then, quite abruptly, she touched Sally on the shoulder and said, "Well, good night," and out she went, with Shadow following. As the door was closing behind them, Shadow looked back. The golden glitter of his eyes seemed to linger in the room long after the door had closed. Mysterious sounds from the darkness outside invaded the quiet room. Branches rubbed against the walls of the old house, trees creaked and groaned in the wind, and a sudden splash of rain hit the window as if a hand had thrown it, and yet Sally felt oddly comforted by the pretty room and its oil painting. She smiled shyly up at the portrait of the other Sally and her doll. She wondered what the other Sally would think if she could see her placing her clothes in the top drawer of the blue painted chest. "She looks nice," she thought. "I think I would have liked her. But I don't like Aunt Sarah, and I don't like Shadow," she told herself as she put on her pajamas. "I don't like them at all." Before getting into bed, she looked around the room at the wallpaper, sprinkled with tiny bouquets of pink flowers that reminded her of the violets on the curtains in her mother's sewing room. A small white desk held a feather pen stuck into a blue bowl, filled with tiny white pebbles. The dainty blue chair next to it seemed to be the very chair upon which the other Sally was seated in the picture. She sat down in the chair and tried to imagine how it must have felt to be that other Sally so long ago. She looked up at the painting, and she placed her hands just like the other Sally's hands and pretended that she was holding the soft cottony body of the little doll. As she went to sleep that night with the patchwork quilt pulled up to her chin, almost the last thing she was conscious of was the painting. The rain had almost stopped. Moonlit suddenly flooded the room. In the silvery light, the picture seemed to spring to life. In just another moment, if Sally could keep her eyes open, the other Sally might step down by the way of the mantel and enter the room she had left so long ago. But the very last thing she heard, just as she was dropping off to sleep, was a mournful yowl, which might have been the wind or perhaps shadow, somewhere in the darkness beyond her window. She woke up once that night, shivering from a dream in which Aunt Sarah, wearing a pointed black hat and a great billowing black cloak, was riding upon the back of an enormous shadow. Closer and closer they came, and closer and closer. She lay awake in the dark for a long time, trembling, and in the strange moaning blackness, with the trees beating like wings at the mysterious old house, it seemed quite possible to her that Aunt Sarah might indeed be a witch. But when she fell asleep again at last, it was to dream that she was playing with the other Sally and her doll upon the round rag rug beside the bed, and that sun was streaming in through the windows. That's the end of that chapter. We read the next chapter. The next chapter is called Alone, and we'll read it next time. That